This conference will now be recorded.
All right, that is our cue that it is 1 p.m. Welcome to this webinar, Life and Living, A View from Death and Dying. My name is Emily Hill. I'm the Education Program Coordinator for Canadian Ministries of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. I just want to let you know before I introduce our guest speaker that during this webinar, we appreciate if you keep your video and sound off. We will be recording, and that's just we love seeing your faces and hearing from you, but just to protect your privacy, as this will be posted online afterwards, please keep your camera and your sound off. Where you can ask questions or make comments is in the chat feature. It looks like a little cartoon bubble that you see, chat bubble, so please feel free to click on there and you're welcome to ask any questions that you want from Dr. Acolatse there. And what else do I have to say? I think that's it. So I'm going to stop talking now. I'm going to also turn off my camera, and I'm going to turn it over to the Reverend Dr. Esther Acolatse. And I wanted to say a warm welcome. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this for us. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you, Esther, for being here.
Thank you, and welcome to everyone. You've already heard my name. I am a new transplant from the US to Canada and currently teach at Knox College at the University of Toronto. And I was invited by Reverend Hill to help us think about death and dying, because she'd read a little piece I'd written about embracing and resisting death. And part of my concern was the kind of denial that we tend to live in modernity about death. It seems to be now almost a four-letter word that we don't talk about and we pretend it's not there. And yet for me, death and dying has always been more about living. So that the way people die and what we do with our dead say more about who we are and how we live. And across the world, there are death cultures that help us get acquainted with who people are. So what does it mean that primarily in the West especially, we have become this death-denying culture? And why is it that in the hospital that is set up by churches to help people die well, we have instituted to be the place where we actually deny that people come to die? Many years ago, I was a chaplain in a retirement institution. And in that institution was cottages for independent living. Then there was assisted living, and then a healthcare center. And I was in charge of the healthcare center. And we all knew that if you transitioned from independent living to assisted living, you were eventually coming to the healthcare center, where, as we used to say, we discharge people upstairs rather than out of the doors. So if this is the truth, that everyone comes to die, why do we live the rest of our lives as if it should not be in preparation for death? And how is it that even we Christians who know we come to our lives through death help in perpetuating this myth? What we know for sure about all human beings is that the beginning of your life is a signal for your growth towards death. Sure, things happen in between, and we focus on living and we assume that that is it. But every breath we take, every inch we add to our bodies, is a journey really towards death. So why is it that we don't talk about? Why is it that we don't talk about death? Okay, I am going to try and see if I can. We live, we live in a death-denying culture, and there's evidence of this all around us. And such evidence for me includes, but not limited to, our emphasis on youth and youthfulness and agelessness, even in this COVID-19 age. We still have ads for various anti-aging creams. We are still being primed for youth-driven lifestyles. We have this subtle, embedded disregard for the aged. And we know that because this pandemic has shown us how little we care about the elderly when we look at the numbers that are dying all around us. There is a serious commodification of longevity. I don't know how many people are on vitamins, but not just basic vitamins. We have people who are giving us various products within those vitamins, supplements. Every day somebody comes up with something new. And yet, we all know that we have come really to die. We really are prepackaged for this final end. So I have thrown out there a list of things that I think indicate that we live in a death-denying culture. And I wonder if there are any that you might want to add. So this is time to either unmute and say something or type it in the chat box so we can all share. Any other evidence you see around us that indicates that we live in a death-denying culture? Okay. But this has not always been the case with us, even in the West. Over time, we've seen subtle shifts in Western attitudes to death. In the past, people lived close to nature, a kind of what we assume First Nations and more primitive cultures do today. And by primitive, I'm not saying this in any pejorative sense. I'm thinking more of a certain earthiness, you know, where you didn't buy your food in pre-packaged portions like chicken legs and feet and wings and what have you, that you actually lived with the animals that you consumed and knew that death is what sustained you and knew that you got your life from the fact that someone gave you their life. And I've already indicated how it is that our attitude to death sums up what we understand by life, and that how we treat death and dying say more about what we believe about life than we know. And when we look at death cultures, what people do with their dying, we know that for a fact. People who live close to nature come to death with a certain acceptance. Primal life was always like that. Ancients knew that you came to die, and that a certain consciousness of one's own frailty was always present with how one lived. As Christians, we know David's prayer, especially in Psalm 103, invites God to be gentle with him in his sin, because God should remember that he is dust, frail. And sometimes I think that when we hear dust, we still think soil. And soil even has substance to it. You see, you can pick it up in your hands and weigh it. But dust, you can barely see, let alone hold in your hands and weigh and see. If we have that kind of consciousness in our minds when we think about who we are, coming to death should be so close to our own hearts and our beings. But more than that, because you saw death around you, animals died, people died, and they were not dying in a hole in a corner somewhere. You sort of had an embedded a collective destiny of all created things. There was no individual I that something was happening to. This is something that happened to everyone, sometimes at the same time, sometimes one after the other. I think I'm seeing things in chat.
Yes, so there are some answers to the questions that you gave, the question you gave about what is evidence of.
Okay.
And so someone says cryogenics as an answer. Yes. And someone else says people are afraid to talk about death. If we talk about it, it might happen. So there's this sense of, it could happen if we talk about it.
Yes, because especially with us Christians, depending on where you land, you might think that, this famous saying that prosperity gospel people bandy around about the power of the tongue, as if we have creative power. What we say happens, which is more close to fatalism than any real Christian doctrine. We do not have creative power. Talking about death doesn't let it happen. It happens because we say we are mortal, and being mortal just comes with death comes with the territory of being being mortal. Thank you for those comments. So historian Philip Aries, in a wonderful book called Western Attitudes to Death, helps us understand how we have come to this place by tracing the history of attitudes to death from maybe a little focus on ancient times, but primarily from medieval times through our current time. And he tells us that in medieval times, we always lived with death at hand. You know the tales of knights in those days, especially even if you thought of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, and you see people on their deathbeds awaiting death in very gentle ways. You know that death is coming, and you got ready for it. And this period he called the period of tamed death. You were surrounded by family as you did the work of dying. And he tells the story of Don Quixote, who died around the 17th century. And he calmly tells someone attending him that he can feel death coming. And here was somebody who had lost his mind, supposedly, just before, but he acquired his senses back via the warning signs of death. And I think that when people are going to die, they know if we would give them room to do that. And I have seen that aplenty being a chaplain in this retirement home that I talked about. So that he might be conscious of what was going on so that he might himself do this final act that all of us would come to. And I have seen people who have been ill, roused to life again, looking radiant and beautiful. And just when you think, oh, they're going to live, they die. And I am convinced, I'm not the fourth person of the Trinity, but I'm convinced that God accompanies everyone, gives us a tap on the shoulder, and says, it's time. And if we would give people permission, and if we will give ourselves permission, we can tell when the end is coming. And yet our culture and our lives are so crowded with so many things, busyness, pollution, noise pollution. We have our TV and our radio and our laptop and our phones on all at the same time. We can't hear ourselves think, let alone signals from outside. And then in those days, people would die surrounded by loved ones. If people feared death at all, it was more fear of dying alone. Death was familiar. Familiar in the sense of say, part of the family. It was in and out often enough and was not hidden in a corner. In such a culture, one assumed one's own death when one saw other people dying. So death was familiar, was frightening later, but was never denied. And then we find shifts in the 19th century. We move from the period of death as familiar to death familiar, quite frightening, but was never feared. There were rituals, laid down rituals that attended how people died. And in many ways, it was the dying who presided over their own dying, over their own death. They will have rituals, they will have incantations, they would have psalms and prayers and masses that they will say over their own dying before this 19th century. And what happened in the 19th century shift is that death was assumed but feared. And then the kind of ritual that attended the dying before, when they presided over their own dying, which became quite banal, never more than we would sing Christmas carols on Christmas Eve, those rituals gradually lost their banality because the kind of what you might call collectivistic culture and collectivistic ethos that attended your death and my death shifted as we became more individualistic, so that my death was not everyone's death and everyone's death was not mine. I was very conscious now of my own death as just my death, as something that was just happening to me. And so a certain seriousness attended it, but then the dying person became sorrowful at their leaving. So they shuttled between what you might call going gently into the night and mourning their own impending death. So the deathbed was present, the dying was still presiding over their death, but now death was feared, and the attendant sorrow was shared by the family, who were empathizing because they were now thinking not of the person who was dying, but then of their own impending death, as well as the loss that will ensue from the death of the loved one. And that is part of this present moment where we fear that if we talk about death, it might show up. So how did we move into this death-denying culture in our present state? How did we get from death, tamed death, to death that we feared but never denied, to a place where we don't only fear death, but also deny it? I think that part of our problem is the compartmentalization of our living stemming from industrialization. That contributes a lot to our present reticence about death. We live life at a very artificial level. And living life at this very artificial level has made it easy for us to elide death, to bracket it from our thoughts and our lives and move on. In spite of over 100,000 deaths in the US, there are people who still hold on to what they call fact, that this pandemic is a hoax cooked up somewhere to derail someone's election into office. How that is possible, well, you probably know better than I do. I can't figure. From birth to the grave, we have found ways to minimize any intrusion of death on our doorsteps. And with that also comes a certain minimization of pain and suffering. I think of even how many pills and things we ingest to avoid labor pains. Any women on the blog, please forgive me. To how we medicalize every little ailment and not wait enough to see if our bodies can tell us something different even from this pain, and whether if we wait a little, things will right themselves before we medicalize. Our pharmacies and our grocery stores are full of every little thing we need for every ouch we find. From birth to grave, we are top heavy with denying death. And that is what I mean by our culture's influence that foster our current denial. And this is not to be talking about anti-technology or anti-progress. You and I are meeting on this on this platform because of technology and because of progress. But we need to be careful about what it does to us, making us people who are not made from earth, from soil, from dust, and people who live in artificially constructed places, and we forget that we are earth things. From our food to fun, everything is created from somewhere else for us. How many know how much flavor enhancing things they put in food to tell us that it is this product when it could be anything else? You could be eating an apple pie made from something else, but they've just put a little scented apple, something that they created in a lab somewhere, onto that product. This is my way of saying that we are living farther and farther away from the earth, farther and farther away from who we were made to be. We are becoming creatures of some people who have set themselves up to remake humans in their image for their own ends. We may give it a fancy name called capitalism, but all of that we as church people need to watch. We are humans, human from humus, earth things. So the farther we are from our source, the more we deny who we are, and the more we forget that we are mortal, as we used to say in Philosophy 101, Socrates is immortal, all mortals are, you know that. So to be human is to be mortal. So we come prepackaged for death. It should be on our lips. It should be taken for granted, not in any morbid way, that we ought to know and people ought to know. What we have today and the way we die today is what Aris terms wild death, where death is no longer familiar. Death has become the total enemy that we fight tooth and nail with our medical arsenal. Look at the hospital scenes, even via the numerous TV medical shows, The Good Doctor, now there's a new one, transplant, nurses, name it. Defibrillators, parts to charge people back to life. People die bruised and battered, wildly flailing arms. What ought to bring comfort and what we ought to enter ourselves gently gets done for us outside. I always say die is a verb. You need to do it yourself. When we went to primary school, they taught us that verbs were doing words, yes? You should die yourself. It should not be something that someone does for you. And our current culture has brought us to the place where we are medicalizing, actually over-medicalizing death. Over-medicalizing death because of how we are learning medicine today. The attitude to medicine that gives the impression that if someone, death is anathema, suffering is anathema, and that if you come to the hospital and you don't get well and leave it, then it is a failure of medicine. And so we have to do everything we can to make sure that you live, even if that life does not constitute wholeness and real living. So that by the end, what you have is a person who is unrecognizable, is bruised and battered with machines from everywhere. And then we turn off that machine after many days or even months. And you might say, if this is a fight, death still wins. Wild death, where death is no longer familiar, part of us, but becomes the total enemy we fight tooth and nail with our medical arsenal. And we are not saying that medicine is not good or that we should not do all in our power to improve the life of the sick and to delay death when possible. But when it is clear that dying is the next best thing in this particular situation, what do we do? I think that the cure for over-medicalization of death is to understand and reclaim dying as a spiritual and sociocultural event rather than a medical one. We need to distinguish death and dying. Death may be biological and medical. If they want the cadaver later to do whatever with, the medical people can have it. But dying is socio-cultural, and that is where you and I, who have signed on and have a garb that says that we come and help people die well come in. I have watched student chaplains come to the hospital wearing hospital gowns. When I ask, they say, well, that gives them power or that opens doors for them. And I say, yes, fine. If that opens the doors and people can tell that you belong here, bring your collar. Say that, carry your Bible. Say that you have come to do the work that the dying require, someone to help them die well. People should be allowed to die the way they have lived, unless it's an accident. Gentle people should not be tortured on their way to doing their final work. And I think that we Christians know a thing or two about how this should be done. Our scriptures are full of ways to help people die well. Jesus himself is an exemplar of this. Our baptism reminds us we come to die so we might live. That is where we start. This dying thing is in the forefront of our minds. Jesus, on his way to death, still has people doing a pretty party on Palm Sunday as he prepares towards death. You do it intentionally. And we are told, knowing who he was, knowing where he was headed, goes on his feet and washes hands. Conscious of impending death, living into the moment rather than letting death happen to one. So that even though we're talking about dying, really, we're talking about living and what life means and what is not just there, but here, what it looks like here. In a moment, we'll have time for questions and we will say more. And I find that our problem sometimes, even as Christians, is not the death part, but the dying part. See, because we assume that death happens, but we don't want to actually be present to do it. If it could happen without us, we would take it. Unfortunately, that is not possible. When I teach a course on death and dying across cultures, really, because I think that other cultures can teach us in the West more about how to do this well, I invite students to several exercises to preempt their dying. So by second week, I ask them to bring their obituaries, and they are invited to choose the manner of dying with which they want to depart this earth, and choose time and whatever age. It could be now or in the future. And then when they would bring in their obituaries, we would analyze and we would ask questions and ask, so why did you choose such and such a type of dying? Mind you, this course is called, care at the end of life, but it is also about suffering and dying well. And what I've noted for all these years is that everybody wants to die at 100, and either they want to die at 103, quietly in their beds with their dogs by their side, or they want to die immediately. Everyone wants to skip the suffering. And yet we've been told statistically that 75% of us will die from an ailment through which we suffer. So there are 17 of us on this call now. So you do the math. And we know the various diseases that people carry with them. Cancer seems to top everything, but then there's Alzheimer's, there's Parkinson's. We have various things. And yet, among us Christians, even among us Christians, we want sudden death or quietly in old age with nothing happening to us. And we have someone we nickname Man of Sorrows, acquainted with grief. And then we will do living wills, advance directives. And I would ask them who they shared that with before they turned it in. Of course, they are afraid to let anyone know they're even doing something like this. But many of them are trying to save close loved ones from grief, even with this mock trying to preempt dying. And I think that the way we understand suffering is all part of our death denying problem and our death denying culture. But living wills, advance directives didn't start with us, you know. It was already becoming part of people dying in the 17th century when they began to focus on themselves rather than death as something that happened to everyone. What Aries calls thy death, when the dying did not only preside over their own death, but also began to choose and delegate affairs to trusted people. So they will fund masses and religious services and give alms. And then they would write their wills, which for us today has been, reduced to these living wills and legal documents. And then they would distribute their fortunes. And then what we find over time, beyond the suffering that we are trying to hide from, not just our own selves, but others, is what he calls forbidden death, which started around the 1930s. So from tamed death to thy own death, we come to forbidden death, where the individual was being shielded from impending death. We will lie about whether their ailment was unto death, whether the sickness was unto death or not. And we might assume that what it is to actually fortify the dying so that they can do their dying well. But much of that was also to shield the living, a certain false hope, which we know Christians should not dabble in. A certain false hope was being given to the dying as well as to the living. So what is our cure? So that we can go back to tame death, where death is a friendly foe, as it were, what we assume all around us, so that we can do the serious work of coming to our dying with integrity. So this is our chance to torpedo the over-medicalization and lean into Christian holistic practices. And that needs to start with the rituals we've always had that surround sickness. Because as I said, our problem sometimes is not the death itself, as it is the suffering and the dying process. And because of time, I will talk just about praying for the sick, but I will send Ms. Hill a couple of articles that she can give out later. One she probably already has on an essay that I have, and then essays by Westerfield Tucker on Christian rituals surrounding sickness, and another on Christian rituals surrounding sick. I've already said that we as Christians are already primed for death because we come to our life through death, but we also know from scripture that we are enjoined to pray for the sick. But what does it mean? It always raises issues for Christians when it comes to praying for the sick. We read the Gospel of Mark, is the shortest one, so I'm going there, and we see how many times Jesus paused to heal someone. Why is it that today that is not part of what we do? Why is it that today we have ceded all caring and praying and curing the sick to the medical world? I don't know where you stand on theology of healing, but I take my cue from James in the prayer for healing. He says, is anyone among you sick? First call the elders. If the person has committed any sin, they will be forgiven. And the prayer of the faithful, or the prayer of faith, will heal the sick. I don't know what you think it means, but I have come to the place where I'm thinking, in light of death and in light of all that we are talking about, that what James begins that chapter with, does anyone lack wisdom, has to do with how do we find wisdom. And this is James 5. Hopefully I can type in this, but I don't think so. Oops. Okay. Sorry. It's James 5, I believe, 5:14. But he starts by asking that if we lack wisdom, we should ask. And this is how I have begun to understand that invitation to ask God for wisdom. Wisdom when we are praying for the sick. Wisdom to ask, is this sickness unto death in which God is calling a loved one home? I've already said I'm not the fourth person of the Trinity. But I think that we who live with God and are willing to live intimately with God, if we walk in community with the Holy Spirit and with fellow believers, we can discern whether this is what I am calling coming from the pit of hell, which we can resist and say no to, and say not on our watch, and say not today is not a good day to die, but we are going to hold on to God's skirts until something happens. Or we can discern our brother, our sister, our mother, our loved one, or even we ourselves are being called to join the church triumphant, and we can ask for resources to attend to this final act that we should all come to. And even though I have talked a lot about over-medicalization, I think part of the problem with medicine is that it has not quite learned how to distinguish suffering and pain. Pain is somatic, suffering is intrapsychic. It has to do with existential issues. It has to do with how I live with myself and with others. And if medicine can make the distinction between pain and suffering, it will not try to medicalize suffering, which only spiritual care providers like us can help people through. And when people will attend to their suffering, which is more existential, which has to do with how I have lived my life and what I'm leaving behind, and what the psychologists call generativity, and how the past comes together into the future, and how the future will remember my past, which is what our work is. And medicine will apply itself to the somatic, and we can work in tandem. Then people can be made ready for their final act. You know how it is that when you're sick, sometimes you become alienated from your community, the many in our healthcare facilities and in our elder care facilities who can no longer function, fully. You become alienated from your family, but you also become alienated from your body. You only become that part of your body that hurts. Those of us who have aged parents, we hear my leg, my foot, my neck, my head, just that part of the body that is ailing becomes who you are. And we are more than our ailing parts. Medicine is good if it will attend to reducing pain in those ailing parts so that we can experience ourselves as one whole again. And then, not so much that we might then live at all costs, but that we can attend prayerfully with integrity to our final act of dying. It is not a failure of medicine, nor is it a failure of our prayers. It has nothing to do with God's will or won't. It has to do with joining the church triumphant. And it is nothing extraordinary. It is. Our lives end. We are mortal. We may go to the lapsarian, supralapsarian debates on whether we were always created like that, but that is for another day, or whether sin brought it into the world. That is for another day. For now, we want to lean into these Christian holistic practices. And if we do that faithfully, then talking about death in our congregations will not be a problem. Baptism becomes an opportunity to say, this nice little girl in a frock just invited herself to die so she can live for Christ. And we recall that ourselves every day. So that is the way we also preempt our dying, by these little acts. When you go to the grocery store and the little person doesn't know you are Dr. Hill and speaks trash to you, you don't let them know who you are. You die a little, and then you go your way, preempting that final act. Okay, so I will end here and invite questions and input.
Wow, thank you so much. You've given me personally a lot to think about today, and I'm very, very grateful in the best kind of way. Does anybody have questions? You are welcome to turn on your microphone. You are welcome to type them in the chat box. And it's okay if there's a little bit of silence first, because I'm sure some of you are still processing. But we welcome your questions at this time. So we have a question. How can we approach the fear of death as Christians?
Good question. If it is my own fear of death or another's, could also be a way to look at that question. But as Christians, we know that death does not have the final word about us. And the resurrection, if we believe it, tells us that we cannot fear death, because our next self-consciousness after this is to be in the presence of God fully. Right now, we're in the presence of God. We may not feel it fully. But in that moment, when this world that encroaches and impinges is away, we will be in the presence of God fully. So for us as Christians individually, the question then becomes, do we believe in the resurrection? And then for me, it leads to, do we actually believe in creation from nothing? Because I find that our issue is not resurrection, it's creation from nothing. And so because we cannot believe in creation from nothing, we can't figure how we will come back after we are dust. So I would ask us to go back to creation and believe creation from nothing. If we tiptoe around creation from nothing and evolution, we are never going to make it to resurrection fully because we want to hold on to something. But how do I tell other people, don't be afraid? We put a seed in the ground. It's not only because scripture says it, but we see it becomes more, always. So then we ask, are you afraid of death or of dying? And I think I've tried to touch on the fact that the dying bit, we have rituals to attend to that aspect of death so that people can come to comfort, which means being shored up, which is comfort. Comfort is not there. It is comforte. We, no, to shore you up for that work. And we are not alone, never. I hope this helps a little.
Thank you. You've already begun to address this a little bit, but I'll bring the question to you that's here. If people are reluctant to talk, what steps can we talk? What can we do to open up dialogue? So many of the people on this call are interested in seniors ministry or might be working with seniors, and sometimes I think all of us, but approaching death and talking about death with that generation seniors is difficult. So what steps can we do to open up that dialogue?
Okay. Maybe it's also because I come from a culture that is not reticent about death at all. I remember my mother constantly saying when we were growing up that when she puts her real face on, we should do such and such. In other words, this face that she wears is artificial because she's animated with what she's thinking is showing on her face. But when she dies, then her real face will show. And in my computer, I already have she's written things for what things she wants when she dies. So I grew up already telling my son what to do when I die. And I'm wondering if there's a way we can return to. Christmas 2015, I think I gave her a book, which I will send a link to you about. It's called Now and at the Hour of Our Death. And it is a booklet in which you write your obituary, the hymns, your bank, everything. But it's a book, and you can actually walk through. So then when I say that death is more about living, now we are talking about my relationship with my parents. That makes me say, Mom, I think, this is your 80th birthday, so can we talk about death? And can I have on paper what things you want? Because I don't want my brothers and sisters to do funny things after you. So I have it. I took a picture of it, sent it to everyone. So I think what is calling attention to is the kind of relationships we have. And then leaning into that now. But it means that I have to start talking about my own death. And talk about death the way I talk about life. Does that make sense a little?
Yes, more than a little. We have a couple of more questions that are a little bit connected. So how do we discuss this, I think, death and in the context of new life given to us in Jesus? What is that new life? And I think the next question from someone else is a bit connected. She says, my pain is with the mothers in the Myanmar refugee camps where they are holding their dying children, yet they are smiling. Do they know that their sick and hungry children are going to a better place? So how do we talk about new life in the context of death, I think is the question.
Yes. And we know as Christians that death hurts God because Jesus demonstrated that even when he was on his way to raise Lazarus. He still shook his head, snorted, and said, no. We know that he resisted in Gethsemane before he said yes. So we do know that this is not. It is what Bart will call the impossible possibility. For me to live is Christ, to die is gain. Whether we live or die, we are the Lord's, we say. Nothing changes except location for those of us who belong with God. We were known and loved before we were made. That doesn't change in death. And I think that is a Christian hope. When a mother in a refugee camp is holding a child, is that false hope who is dying? Or they know something that you can't take from them? Not just something, but someone. If we believe this one says that we are more than sparrows and that he counts hair, then he counts ribs from malnourishment, and he is there. Maybe these women know. But then it also says something about our living, doesn't it? What can we do so that that doesn't happen? Not to assuage our guilt or sadness, so that our touching is to give, not to get. Not easy.
Not easy at all. Thank you. We're getting close to 2 p.m. here Eastern time, and so I want to respect everyone's time. I will, for those of you who are wondering, how are we going to get our hands on these great resources? When Esther sends them to me, I will make sure that I send it to everybody who signed up for the webinar. If you did not pre-register, I'm just going to type my ehill@presbyterian.ca is how you can get in touch with me. That's in the chat box. You can also find me on the website. Even if you just email the national office, somebody will find me, and I'll make sure that you get these resources. So I just wanted to say a very, very, very warm thank you. And I really appreciate the words that you've spoken today and the knowledge that you've shared to us about your experience and your research. It's been a real pleasure to have you with us. And to all of you out there who are watching now and who may be watching this later, I pray the Lord's blessing on you and on your day. And may God be with you on this journey of life where we are, moving towards death, but doing so with the knowledge of of walking with the resurrected Christ in all that we do. We're Easter people, and that's something to celebrate. So we have a lot of people saying thank you, Esther, in the chat box. And we're going to sign off now, but this video will be available. So thank you to everyone. Much appreciated. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.